Hello, I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. We're living in an advanced digital era, a fourth industrial revolution, so it's no surprise that ICT, information and communications technology, is weaponizing information in profound ways. We're also living in an era of resurgent great power competition. How China is marshaling information power to gain technological, economic, and military superiority is at the heart of this three-part series. Now, today I'm joined by four great thought leaders from the United States and Australia. They bring a wealth of expertise on cyberspace, national security, and defense policy. Mark Montgomery is a retired Rear Admiral in the U.S. Navy. Among his key assignments, he was the Director of Operations, the J3 in the Pacific Command, as it was called then. He served as the Executive Director of the congressionally mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and he's now the Senior Director of the Center on Technology and Cyber Innovation at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, FDD. Dr. Lesley Seebeck holds a PhD in information technology. She's worked in various government departments in Canberra, including as Chief Investment and Advisory Officer at the Digital Transformation Agency. Outside government, Dr. Seebeck has been Chief Executive at the Cyber Institute at the prestigious Australian National University, ANU. Peter Jennings is arguably Australia's top authority on defense. He held senior positions across the government for years before becoming Deputy Secretary for Strategy in the Defense Department from 2009 to 2012. And since then, he served as the Executive Director of Australia's premier defense think tank, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI. And Dr. Nina Kollars is Associate Professor within the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College. In Newport, she is also a core faculty member in the Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute, where her research focuses on cybersecurity, future warfare concepts, and military technological integration. Now let's begin by outlining the challenge posed by China's information power. After that, we'll consider how the United States and Australia can best protect national security. It's challenge just trying to characterize the threat posed by China's information power. In the book, China's Quest for Foreign Technology, information power is fivefold. The strength of domestic STEM, the science and technology and engineering and math sector, the intellectual property theft capability, big data collection and analysis, information propagation, and cyber warfare. Let me invert that and highlight 3 points: military might, technological advantage, and the impact of big data and narrative. First, there's a direct military dimension. The People's Liberation Army relies on the three warfares concept that emphasizes propaganda, psychological warfare, and lawfare. PLA modernization for decades has focused on contesting information dominance and waging cyber conflict. But secondly, China's geopolitical challenge centers on technology. The China dream hinges on achieving technological primacy in areas like fifth generation 5G telecommunications, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and with earlier campaigns such as Made in China 2025 to the military civil fusion integration that crosses Chinese entities, Xi Jinping hopes that China can leverage technology to become the dominant economy and build a military second to none. China's intelligence services have fully tapped cyberspace to acquire intellectual property, including designs of weapons or potentially to introduce malware into security systems. The domination of the ICT supply chain is a critical issue. As cryptologist and author Bruce Schneier asks, can you trust the technology built in countries whose governments you do not trust? And China appears to be seeking an unsurpassed collection of big data, perhaps to be used for nefarious purposes in future years. So beyond big data, there's the broader third point here, the attempt to wield discourse power, to control narratives and conduct influence and interference operations. We've seen this at work recently as China squeezes Australia with economic coercion unless it buys into Beijing's narratives about COVID origins or Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And Chinese officials are busy perpetuating the myth that democracy is in the grip of a death spiral when compared with the sheer efficiency of an autocratic model of government that can better conceal its myriad deficiencies. Well, I've assembled this brilliant panel to help crystallize dimensions of the challenge emerging from China's rise as an information superpower. So let's begin with Mark Montgomery, then we'll go to Lesley Seebeck, then stay down under with Peter Jennings, and return to the Northern Hemisphere with Nina Kollars. So Admiral Montgomery, Mark Montgomery, it's over to you, please.
Thank you, Patrick, and it's great to be here with such a distinguished panel. As you mentioned, I come from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where I'm still a senior advisor. So I think I'll start my my thoughts in the Chinese cyber threat, and then maybe talk a little bit about supply chain. So great powers like China and Russia use cyber operations to enable their warfighting capabilities. We know that. They advance their interests short of armed conflict as well. They undermine the economic strength of their adversaries like the United States and Australia. They try to sap our political will, and they try to weaken our military might. China very specifically uses cyberspace to accelerate its economic rise. It has used it to undermine the US comparative advantage in warfare areas, and it's also used it to suppress political opponents at home and abroad, and I think we'll hear about some of that today. Chinese Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT groups, have stolen intellectual property on a breathtaking scale. The Intellectual Property Commission attributed nearly $1 trillion in lost GDP over a 15-year period, the majority of which can be attributed to Chinese efforts. They've also stolen sensitive national security information for the United States. Beijing has waged what we call the cyber-enabled economic warfare to fuel its rise while simultaneously undercutting US economic and military superiority. Chinese cyber campaigns have enabled the theft, as I said, of nearly $1 trillion of intellectual property, but at the same time, their APT's aggressive cyber-enabled intelligence collection operations have provided Chinese officials with improved intelligence information to use against the United States and its allies through their penetration of unclassified email systems. Chinese operators constantly scan the US government and our private sector networks millions, if not billions of times a day to identify vulnerabilities that can later exploit in a crisis. They've targeted our American weapons systems and our defense industrial base, which are largely managed in cloistered, unclassified networks. And it's enabled Beijing to undermine our opponents from within. What I mean by that is they threaten the US defense industrial base by stealing the intellectual property without having to make the research and development investments of their own. Sometimes they can use this information to drive a wedge between America and its allies. I mean, really taken to the extreme, if China were to use these same skills in a malicious way, they have the ability to launch cyber attacks in the United States that could cause localized, temporary disruptive effects on all of our critical infrastructure, whether it's natural gas pipelines, electrical power grids, water systems for days, if not weeks. You know, from our perspective, without kind of thinking of, without developing a response strategy, I know we'll talk about that in a minute, and without significant changes to how the United States defends itself in cyberspace, Chinese operations will continue to threaten long-term American economic prosperity and our national security. The drivers of risk are the interconnectivity of our systems, which is increasing exponentially, and the availability of tools to the adversary, to the Chinese APTs, which is increasing exponentially. The only mitigator of risk is linear. That's our investment in cybersecurity defense. So when your two risk drivers are exponential and your risk mitigator is linear, you're headed for a significant vulnerability and challenge period. These kind of things are going to undermine confidence in the US government's ability to protect its own citizens and businesses. If you think about probably what the worst aspects of the SolarWinds software penetration were, or the more recent Microsoft Exchange server, one by Russia and one likely by China, it's the undermining of the confidence and the credibility of the US government's ability to even protect itself, much less the broader national critical infrastructure. So along with this loss of national power, trust in American institutions will wither. We see that particularly in the Russian attacks on our democratic institutions, but we have seen more broad long-term efforts by China against the United States, but more clearly against many of our allies and partners, including Australia. In the minds of regional allies, the perception of this unchallenged Chinese effort, this work in the gray zone below which we won't respond with a use of force, really undermines the credibility of America's security guarantees writ large. This exfiltration of private sector intellectual property could compel investors at some point to question the viability of the US economy as a hub of technological innovation. And breaches could also yield intelligence coups that threaten the United States clandestine personnel and advance Beijing's diplomatic and economic goals as well. We've certainly seen that with Russia, and I don't think it's too far off to see it with China. Stolen US military technology has also enabled the production of really capable facsimiles in the Chinese Air Force and Navy, and we see that operating on a daily basis. Compromised supply chains could undermine our military operations in the future. I mean, we see SolarWinds today as a espionage event, and it was. But if it had been the installation of malware for future use, it could have had an equally devastating effect on U.S. response and attempt to build up forces in a crisis or contingency operation. Beijing has gained unprecedented power to surveil and control the lives of individuals worldwide, not just in China. And our ability to operate in those networks in both steady state and contingency operations is compromised as the Chinese networks proliferate throughout Africa and South Asia. And we have to be very sensitive to that issue as well. Really in improving its cyber tech capabilities and altering information online, China has been able to shape the views of not only its own citizens, but international citizens towards the United States. All of these are debilitating effects that we're seeing from Chinese cyber operations. So it really extends across the economic, military, and information operation spectrums. And we're going to have a hard time countering this, and I hope we get an opportunity to talk about that in a moment.
Mark, it's all very sobering, and I must also add that the Solarium Cyberspace Commission just did outstanding bipartisan work for the nation. So there are a lot of lessons in there that we're going to get into. As we turn down to Australia, Lesley Seebeck, how does this challenge look from your perspective?
Okay, so thank you very much for Mark. That was a tour de force across the attack surface, as it were, trying to looking at from the inside out and the concerns we have to think about. I'm going to step back and just look at some of the broader trends that we're seeing, because I think one of the issues we confront is we're trying to grapple with this challenge that we have. And I don't think we fully have a grip on just how much the world has changed when we're dealing with technology, networks, etc. So I'm going to touch on a number of trends. The first one is the cost of technology is declining. So the cost of storage is almost zero. The cost of transmission is close to zero. The cost of computation itself is declining rapidly. So that enables, combine that with democratization of the technology, it enables incredible power to, as we know, sole actors all the way up to nation states. The second one is the interactions themselves are increasing. So once upon a time, governments were used to sort of still talking to governments. Now those connections have thickened across a multiplicity of channels. What that does, if we go back to ideas around evolutionary theories, you're going to see more variations faster as there are more interactions. And what the Chinese have done is they've been able to impose a broad organizing principle, which is, I would argue, the sustained position of the Chinese Communist Party in China, because we shouldn't forget the fact that China itself is being subjected to this, and it's almost as though it's just reaching, or the edge is pushing outwards. So we need to think ourselves about what our organizing principle is going to be in responding to this, because it cannot just be, oh my God, this is bad, we've got to counter it. What is our organizing principle? Speed is increasing in the same way because of the interaction, the cost of transmission, etc. We're going to start seeing more of these cascades across networks, whether it is WannaCry, NotPetya, SolarWinds, and now the exchange, latest exchange attack, because they're interconnected. And we'll find that they go down that stack. we tend to see a lot of the discussion has been around what we're seeing in social media, those cascades. We can expect to see that go down in that physical technological stack. The fourth trend is that mass individualization. So we've gone from, we still tend to think in the world of mass communication, but now these can be very, very tightly tailored. And so that's why we're starting to see individuals targeted with such precision. And that's going to increase as well. The challenge there is going, what does that mean for democracies in particular? Not least because we shouldn't forget that the governments are not the only players in this game. It's also those platforms. How can we get those big tech platforms and actually yoke them to our cause as well when we figure out what that operating principle is? A fifth trend is the shift from, a lot of the focus has been on the technology and the cyber tech side. And there's a lot of color, light, magic movement in that field. It is the business model of many of the vendors to exploit fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which just muddies water. But increasingly, we should be starting to think about the cyber social as well. We shouldn't forget what happened in Rwanda when the rumors were spread and we had a massacre. Arguably, we can see that effect on social networks. And we've seen that in India, we've seen it elsewhere, where suddenly we get this sort of this tipping point across those social networks. And we can see, it's not just, we don't trust institutions anymore. We don't trust the technology. Without adequate recourse, we won't trust each other. And democracies are built on trust. I mean, that is has always been one of their strengths. So we're seeing the erosion of that as well. These are all very pervasive. So again, it's in all our systems. It is across all our activities. It goes down the technology stack, and increasingly it's leaching into our social networks and institutions. And one of the consequences we have to start thinking about is moving, it's a common line in cybersecurity about zero trust systems. Well, we need to now start thinking about zero trust information, for example. Rather than trust but verify, it's almost verify then trust. And how do we build those alternative mechanisms are going to be quite challenging. Now, I think when we look at China, because there's two main players here. There's Russia, which is, its organization principle is almost disruption, yes, maintenance of the oligarchy and so on. China is, yes, maintenance of the CCP, but building and establishing that out in a sort of, a middle kingdom way. So there are two different operating models that we need to think about, rather than merely thinking, this is China, it's a nation state that looks like us. Well, it doesn't. Similarly with Russia. And I think those are the challenges that we're going to be facing when we think about how do we respond, and how do we actually, it's not just respond, how do we improve ourselves? Because there are real challenges and opportunities for questions such as, what does it mean to be an enfranchised citizen in a digital democracy? And unless we actually answer those questions well, we're always going to be on the back foot.
Brilliant, Lesley, thank you. What a wonderful way to kind of cast and frame some of these big issues, from the trends to the organizing principle to how democracies will now have to respond to this. We're going to get into that. We're going to turn to Peter and then Nina. And by the way, when we get to how we respond to these challenges, we're going to go in reverse order. So just to warn you, so Nina, you're going to go back to back, although I'm going to talk a bit before we rush into responses. But staying in Australia, Peter Jennings.
Patrick, thanks so much for involving me in this conversation. There's so many areas that we could cover. What I thought I would do was spend a little bit of time talking about China and the public debate. And maybe a subtitle of this conversation could be A Year in the Life of a Think Tank, because in some respects I'm going to reflect on the experience of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute over the last 18 or so months. My start point is to say that I think what we're seeing happen here in the broadest sense is a PRC strategic goal to dominate the information domain in all its aspects. And one critical aspect of that is how to shape public debates in countries around the world that suit China's interest. Now, the way I'm going to present this to you is really to offer a spectrum of activities and behaviour which move from the one hand to quite open, unashamed attempts to shape public debate, through to more covert attempts to shape public debate. And you can think of this as a spectrum, which is frankly all areas of which are being operated at all times to try to achieve public debate dominance. So let's look at the open propagandizing area. And there what we have seen in Australia is frankly a full-on attempt on the part of the Chinese government to establish a very negative set of commentary about Australia and about Australia's role in the international community. Just this week, China effectively took a report to the UN Human Rights Council complaining about a range of Australian violations of human rights, including alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, some of which are now being actively investigated by our judicial system, through to racial discrimination against Australian Indigenous people. And of course, Australia is a far from perfect country on any of these records. But nevertheless, the attempt to characterise this position of Australia is something which is very actively promoted by the Chinese government and then by the Chinese media, which of course operates in lockstep with the Chinese government. We also have in Australia the Chinese embassy in Canberra and its consulates in various major Australian capitals, which I would argue are now working well outside of acceptable norms for how diplomatic missions behave overseas, seeking to intervene very directly in Australian public debates. And the low point of this, just in the last few months, was the release of a 14-point grievance list by the Chinese embassy, which listed the 14 things that they found most unhelpful in terms of government decision-making. But also on that list was my own institute. We were number 10 for being rude enough to undertake research of a type that the Communist Party doesn't like. By the way, Patrick, I just see that as an opportunity for us to improve our KPIs and move up the list. But there were also complaints about Australian free press, really an attack on basic democratic institutions coming out of the Chinese embassy here in Canberra. So that's the open propagandizing area. The next thing I would point to is an attempt to openly influence Australian media. And this happens in a variety of ways. Up until just a few months ago, we had paid advertising for wraparound sheets of People's Daily reporting being printed monthly with Australian major newspapers coming out of Sydney and Melbourne. That has actually stopped. We have the large-scale mainland ownership of Australian Chinese language press. And we have attempts to essentially shape the narrative used by Australian commentators. So you can trace interesting phrases and language like China threat theory from the pages of the People's Daily through to Australian commentators using similar language. Third area I would say is we see a loose encouragement, might be one way to describe it, through to a coordination of local supporters of China's media position. And that's involving a mix of people, some of whom frankly might have other ideological predilections to promote. There is an element of anti-Americanism in Australian media commentary, which often runs hand in glove with attempts to be more positive about China. And we've also seen really in the last 12 to 15 months, the rise of quite a strong narrative against my own institute, ASPI, which will bring in a number of areas like, for example, ASPI receives funding from the so-called military industrial complex, which happens to be that part of defence industry in Australia that supports the Australian Defence Force. Third area, covert media influencing. We have a quite large contingent of Xinhua media reporters here. In June of last year, a number of those individuals actually left the country, having had their visas revoked following an investigation by our internal security authorities. And I think we will all be aware of a crossover between Chinese media and Chinese intelligence gathering activities. We've also seen quite strong attempts to use online media activity to shape media outcomes. So one thing that I would mention is I notice now whenever I talk to our national public broadcaster, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, you will see a string of Twitter media commentary afterwards directed at journalists from that organisation saying, why are you talking to ASPI? Don't you know this is an organisation that receives funding from defence industry? And there's too much of this for it not to be, in some ways, reflecting a coordinated attempt. I'd mention also, finally, an attempt to quell independent media commentary in Australia. And there are a number of dimensions of that. One, we have found at our own institute, is the constant threat of legal action being directed against us for forthcoming publications, often from Chinese companies. Huawei has been a regular correspondent with us threatening legal action. And I see this, frankly, as an attempt to quell independent media research, or independent research and independent media commentary. I'd have to tell you that the ugly end of this too comes down to pretty direct online social media harassment of individual researchers. If people have connections to the mainland, that can involve threatening families on the mainland. It can involve threats to limit their ability to travel to the mainland, and some pretty ugly trolling. I guess if you're in public life, you expect a certain amount of this anyway, but it's very interesting to note how this has gone up into a significant extent. Look, there are other areas to talk about, but I'll keep my comments short here. We've seen quite a lot of covert PRC attempts to shape public debates through funding of institutions at Australian universities, through attempts to bribe Australian politicians. These are areas which our government has been focused on very substantially in the last few years, but reflect big money and very serious attempts to undermine the independence of Australian universities and to reshape public narratives in ways which are more convenient to the interests of the PRC. Patrick, I'll stop at that point. I do have some thoughts on mitigation strategies, but that's enough for the moment, and let me hand back to you.
Peter, that's an excellent rundown. For those who don't follow Australia closely, they will not be familiar with the litany that you've just gone through. And a lot of those are personal. Those are your institute, which is, of course, the leading defense institute. And Australia is a relatively small arena compared to the United States in terms of institutes. But at the same time, very powerful forces being thrust on you every day. And very important to think about joint responses and the kind of things we can do for resilience, for democracies, to make sure that the interference and influence don't disrupt our systems and push back. We're going to talk more about that. I want to turn first to Dr. Nina Kollars and hear her perspective from in terms of the China challenge. A lot has been covered, Nina, but there are some dimensions that deserve further emphasis. So over to you.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to my panel members. I think it's always its own kind of particular challenge presenting last because, of course, the data points get picked off. But I think that there's still a couple things that I can sort of draw a circle around, and in particular, and I like to think of it from the cyber perspective and from a DoD perspective. We like to think about it in terms of what kind of bad day you're going to have. Because when there's a cyber event, it's universally understood as a bad day. So I think about them in two ways. First, the China challenge is interesting from a purely informational ideas, knowledge, and data standpoint. So when we talk about it from that edge, that bad day looks like what we saw maybe at the SolarWinds hack or the Microsoft Exchange hack. All of those data breaches are about both intellectual property theft as well as espionage. And we have to be careful that we're not lumping that all together because the implications are slightly different for DoD along two different axes. So we worry about the threat. We should worry about the threat of intellectual property theft because it diminishes the United States. One of our core competencies is our power in the marketplace, right? The idea that we can do good research, and that research then results in prosperity for the nation. That is one of the cornerstones. It's one of the United States' PowerPoints. It's why our universities are so well regarded, because of our production of knowledge. And so we do worry about intellectual property theft, even at the DoD level. We worry about that theft. But we also worry about the threat because of things like Chinese supply chain concerns. And I know you have a panel coming up soon that will speak specifically to this question, which is what happens if the data that you trade around, it can be easily stolen or borrowed or siphoned or duplicated or manipulated. And that's one of these problems that we need to wrap our minds around. And that, in terms of espionage, this data fuel, this data loss, right? It fuels this sort of secondary set of everyone's defense concerns about the other kind of bad day, and that's about the automation of the physical world. So one of the major things that keeps military leadership up at night is the problem of cyber physical systems. So it's not just that you have data that you can leverage to shape ideas, right? As Peter Jennings so excellently laid out for us. But the problem is that cyber systems, digital systems are connected to machines that have actuators that do things in the real world. And while that may do things like attack critical infrastructure, shut down power grids, whether that's for short term or worse, from a defense perspective, that could have, it's unclear still, there needs to be more work in this space, but that could have detrimental effects for a force to complete its mission, regardless of what the mission is, right? So cyber physical systems are its own concern. And so this question of supply chain that you're going to hopefully, beautifully delve into, are problematic for our defense, for the United States defense systems in particular, because it isn't just the case that our defense systems are constructed purely by government. Our defense systems are informed directly by and supported by, and quite frankly, made excellent by our private sector. And so again, those two sets of bad days, either the theft of ideas and knowledge or that cyber physical system, those interactions are really worrisome. So how does that connect down to something like the Navy? What does Navy have to do with any of it? And I like to think of it from a maritime perspective in two areas. And I think the language du jour is going to be in competition or in crisis. And so I'll use those two terms. But when we're thinking about competition, the United States' core competencies, again, are its capacity to trade. The United States is a maritime nation, and it's vastly integrated. Its marketplaces, right? That trade system occurs by sea, right? All that shipping, so much of it was well in excess of 25% of the U.S. economy is based on maritime shipping. And so when we think about not just the amount of data that it takes to get all of those goods onto a ship, but then we think about the cyber physical systems that enable the port structures and the ships themselves, and to include that the tighter, the more efficient, the more well-run you want those systems to be, the more you need to automate them. And so the more you need to automate them, that you're onboarding these potential, not actual, we don't know yet, we have to design them better, but potential vulnerabilities, right? So part of the Navy's mission is to ensure that freedom of navigation, the freedom of the seas, so that so much of what undergirds this country has the capacity to get where it's going. Let's not overestimate, though, however, just how reliant the United States is on the freedom of the seas, right? The Chinese also mutually independent need to have goods move around the world, right? So it's not as if we're totally at the whim, but we do need to start thinking carefully about what this means. And then just for, the bigger problem for Navy more specifically is just concern again about cyber physical systems. So much of the technology we use in our military capabilities, the smarter and the more amazing stuff, the more automated stuff, the unmanned stuff, right? Uncrewed, right? These sorts of things can be cyber reliant. We need to be thinking about that as we plan forward. So it's not just current force design, but future force design that the Navy's worried about. And I'll say one last thing, which is that, and I'll bridge potentially forward, Patrick, which is that the Chinese have really gone about this in a beautiful way. They've thought about their digital Silk Road, right? Their strategy about technological engagement with the rest of the world. They've thought about it at a global level. They've thought about it in terms of investment in ports. They've thought about it in terms of sharing technology with lesser developed countries, with countries developing smart cities, right? They have thought about all of that. They've engaged the world with their technology. And so we really need to think about how does the United States and its allies sort of meet that challenge in a meaningful way. And so I'll stop now and I'll let you bridge over to, I think, what is your next question?
Well, Nina, that's perfect. From giving us a bad day in the various ways the day can go bad to sort of the challenge of what we do about this. And some of those areas on sort of trade and infrastructure and sort of digital cooperation may go beyond the scope of this panel, but it certainly relates to, I think, the real policy initiatives that we're likely to see. And I think that we just heard expressed by the Quad Leaders Summit, including Prime Minister Morrison, President Biden, Prime Minister Suga, and Prime Minister Modi at the first virtual Quad Leaders meeting earlier this month, to be followed later this year in the region by an in-person leaders meeting. But Australia and the United States have not been idle when it comes to the kind of information challenge we're talking about here. And all of you have hinted at some of the things that perhaps Australia, the United States, and others are doing. But clearly, we no longer enjoy a wide lead over potential rivals. Indeed, the level playing field with non-state actors has been referred to several times. And so much of our information power resides in private firms. Our big tech national champions are not the same as China's state-owned or state-controlled enterprises. So we have a new awareness of this audacious scope and brisk pace of the challenge, especially China's information power. Increasingly, there appears to be the political will to act. But not only are democracies joining forces to discuss technology standards, norms, and rules, they're also increasing their cooperation on science and technology, on cybersecurity, on building trusted supply chains, digital trust, trusted data, and on countering malign influence operations. But clearly there's growing risk associated not just with the exponential trends that we heard about, but also about the fact that certain technologies could lead to, as Nina was talking about, not just competition, but crisis. Very real concerns about things like AI and hypersonics blending together to create serious risk challenges for crisis management, for risk reduction talks, perhaps directly with China, who knows, and Russia and other countries. But I want to turn back to the four panels now in reverse order, as I suggested. Get your thoughts in shorter responses to what steps, what emphases, what guidelines would you give to policymakers, maybe you are giving to policymakers, to try to help protect Australian, US security in this space. So Nina, I want to go back to you to start, and then we'll turn to Peter Jennings, Lesley Seebeck, and then Mark Montgomery will fire the final salvo before I conclude. So Nina, over to you.
Certainly, and I'll take this again just from the DoD perspective. So much really good work has been done, I believe, at least, I mean, by my colleagues at the Cyberspace Solarium Commission in thinking about how to deal not just offensively, but defensively at the national, domestic level, and how to deal with these challenges of information. And always more defense investments are better. So I'll just say that at the front end, right? So if you have a choice over where to put your next cyber dollar, I'm always encouraging to put that cyber dollar on defense rather than offense. Having said that, I would say that, that one of the things we need to be thinking more carefully about, we need to do, I think, more with more clarity or robustness, is that there's been a lot of work on how to focus down and inside the United States and think about how to pair better with the private sector, how to marshal R&D better to better advance the navies or the armies or the air forces technological capabilities. That's a lot of good work is being done there. I don't see as much clarity or robustness about the up and out, right? So we did the down and in really well. Let's partner with Silicon Valley. And we're working on those initiatives. But the up and out, what does it mean to pair well with our allies like Australia, which we have very robust, right, information trading systems on the defensive side. So what is it? What does working better with our partners and allies? I would implore policymakers to clarify and to really get active about working toward what does it mean to have interoperability among the services? What does it mean to do better information sharing? How do we do it such that we can defend each other equally well? That our defense increases doesn't necessarily decrease someone else's capabilities. And I think, so that up and out picture is really where I would love to see more movement. Thank you.
Peter Jennings, back to you.
Thanks, Patrick. What we're actually seeing here is a broadening of what the Australia-US alliance actually means. You know, the alliance really has its origins in intelligence cooperation and then in a widening sense of defence cooperation. Now we need to think about the alliance in terms of science and technology, supply chains, homeland security. And I think a good question to ask as well, if that's the direction that it needs to go, how fit for purpose is the machinery around the alliance to actually support what we need to do? You know, the key annual driving point of the alliance relationship is the 2+2 that you mentioned, Patrick, which meets for a modest day and a dinner as a rule. And I now think that we need to start thinking about deeper standing forms of policy development and support to give this relationships depth and substance across a much broader field of security. What else to do in terms of the types of challenges that I was talking about? One, I think, is, and we are certainly doing this in Australia, we're working very hard to think through what modern counterintelligence capabilities are after perhaps a decade and a half of a huge amount of intelligence effort going against the risk of Islamist extremism. We're now returning to the origins of counterintelligence as being something which I think is going to be a much more powerful driver of intelligence priority. Secondly, we modernised our espionage laws, something that we hadn't done effectively since the 1960s, to make them fit for purpose against the modern technology-enhanced espionage that we are dealing with in the country at the moment. The third thing that I think we still need to work at, and other countries do too, is to build more clarity around how to think about overt versus covert influencing and how to deal with them. Overt influencing is something that is an appropriate part of how a democratic country operates, but we still need to recognise it when it's happening and be able to respond to it. Covert influencing is something that I think we have tended to underestimate and are only now beginning to realise the depth and the extent of it. And again, mechanisms to push back against that need to be refined and improved. Two final points. I think it's been an important realisation for Australia to understand that we're not alone. A large part of our bilateral dispute with China over the last 18 months or so has been a bilateral dispute precisely because Beijing wants to make it that way. And I think we need to make the case to the world that, in fact, what is emanating from China is a threat to democracies more generally. And therefore, we're all in this together. We need to work ways to develop shared responses back to Beijing to say that this type of behaviour is inappropriate. And I'm very pleased to say, Patrick, I heard Kurt Campbell making precisely those comments just in the last 24 hours or so. So I know that the US understands that. One agenda for a joint piece of Australia-US work, I think, would be for us to develop the playbook for how democracies can strengthen themselves, because, you know, Australia is a pretty robust democracy. We're the world's 13th largest economy. We're probably 13th or 14th largest defence spender. You know, we can square our shoulders and do a pretty good job of dealing with these things ourselves. There are many democracies that are more vulnerable. And I think need help to understand the nature of the threats that are being presented to them. So let's think about the Australia-US playbook for dealing with this type of Chinese attempts to undermine our societies in order to assist those other countries that probably need more help. Back to you.
Well, Peter, that's a great, if ambitious, list of things that we need to look at. And I hope, Lesley, you'll start by giving us the organizing principle that we should be following, because that does seem like the first order of business here. But what recommendations or what guidance would you start with in terms of responding to this challenge?
Okay, I'm going to echo a number of Peter's comments, and possibly, which he's put a lot more eloquently than I had planned. But I think one of the things we have to go back to is look at those values. What is it to be a democracy? And make the case. I think we lost a lot of muscle memory around doing this in the last 30 or so years after the end of the Cold War, because we thought we'd won. And I think we've just accepted it. And I think we need to get back to making the case about why this is such a good thing, why this should be the way forward to counter that authoritarian narrative. And that is something that we need to do, Australia, US, the stronger democracies, but also so we can actually bring those countries that are wavering or, sort of susceptible to influence on board. Given the case and given some assistance, I think, we can actually build a lot, excuse me, build on that a lot more than we actually have in the past. And this is where, I think the US is better placed in many respects, because it's very much I'm not talking about exporting democracy as we have over the last 30 years. I'm arguing for making, the case and actually doing a lot more of that soft power exercise as well. Australia doesn't have, for example, an institute for democracy, such as countries that you find in Taiwan, Foundation for Defence of Democracy. ASPI is doing a sterling job, but we need more in our own civil society to build that out. The second thing is around building more of that strategic framework, because we need to address a whole range of issues in this new world. We cannot just pick up Cold War, even World War II, or even battlefields, ideas and just say, oh, well, it's like Pearl Harbor. Those don't work. So we have to think about, how we work in an untrusted system, whether it's IT, whether it's the information coming across on our phones that has been intercepted, whether it's the operational technology and cyber physical systems. How do we think about escalation in this world? How do we think about, that erosion of capability and the integration of our own operations in that domain as well? Because let's face it, we're already in this world, and we should be starting to come up with some fairly strong strategic concepts and frameworks. The third thing is, and this is a point Peter sort of made last night, and it just resonated with me. When you look at strategy, you don't always look at the glossies on the bookshelves. You go and see where the money is spent. So Australia has got $270 billion, capability program. Is that fit for purpose given this new world? If I was going back and doing my old job as being a CIO and I'm saying I'm in a disruptive environment, I would try and cut down the amount of money I was spending on just keeping things ticking over. I would then put an amount of money for improving that capability to keep up. But there would be an increasing amount of money I would be allowing for doing those new things and exploring the available terrain out there of strategic and operational and tactical possibilities. And I don't think we're doing that enough. And so I think, again, this is something where we can work together a lot more as well. That also goes into something else that is one of my pet bugbears when I go and talk to defence. It is not just the defence institutions doing this. Most of this technology is civilian technology. We need to build those flywheels back into our economy and society. And again, if you look at Australia's level of economic complexity, it has been declining because we have lost manufacturing capability and skill sets. We have outsourced a lot of things that we would normally be in the realm of that public area or public goods. And to that end too, I think it's easy for governments to overestimate the tool set they have available to them. Again, the big tech platforms are an example. Combined, I think they are sitting on cash of in the order of $5.5 billion, $550 billion just cash sitting there. So this is again something we have to think about, how we make that case and how we can then sort of get those all those institutions working together. That said, I think it's a mistake to mimic what China does. And there is a tendency to say, well, they're fusing our civilian and military, therefore we must do the same. They're accessing, putting in back doors into things, we must do the same. I think the guiding principle, the organizing principle there for us must be around democracy. Short term, and I think, again, the things that came out of the Quad were very useful and good first step, but we need to put, some, rubber on the road now. So we start, sitting out, what are those pacing, finding out those pacing activities, because otherwise we'll get lost in the noise. So every 6 months, every 3 months, we need to be able to do things like sit down, we are going to work on building that economic flywheel, whatever shape, form that sort of puts into place. I think too, we can actually, as a material first step, do some of the work and build on some of the work that ASPI and others have been doing in terms of, and this has got to be done by a trusted outsider outside government, I think, to get help build that voice, that breadth of voices that we need. And that is mapping the sources of foreign, of that information warfare activity, mapping their operations, understanding the operations, understanding the targets, and building up the capabilities of those targets to protect themselves, finding out what is going to influence the most or change, change their opinions, etc. There's a lot of work that there that can be done that I think would be a useful first step, particularly if we're thinking about an information warfare and cybersocial activities.
Outstanding list of recommendations. And Mark, in our remaining few minutes, what would you offer here in terms of starting with a response to this challenge?
Well, first, obviously, I think we should all eat Taiwanese pineapples and drink Australian wine. We'll be good to go. But seriously, look, first, I want to double down on what Nina said. When we looked at how do you restore deterrence in cyberspace, either as a nation state or with your allies and partners, the first is you actually do have to defend yourself. One thing both our countries suffer from, is a good thing, is since 1944, neither of us has really had to think about that critical infrastructure attack. We were able to, planes, fighter planes, ships, submarines, missiles didn't really put that threat against us. We had the Atlantic and the Pacific. You had the Pacific. We had good neighbors in Canada and Mexico. Cyber removed that geographic advantage for both of us. And now we actually have to defend our critical infrastructures. The second thing I'll tell you is, for us and for the Australians, it's largely owned, in our case, 85% owned by the private sector. So a series of people, we owned all the submarines, the fighter jets, the destroyers, the tanks. The government owned it. They felt a responsibility to defend it. When they look at the critical infrastructure, it's a much harder sell. It's not, the Department of Defense or the MOD's responsibility to defend it. That critical infrastructure, that cybersecurity investment needs to be made by companies. I think this gets at one of Lesley's points. For us, our assessment is that's 10 to 12% of your IT budget needs to be in cybersecurity, and we're not seeing that. Look, there's some exceptions. Banks, big banks, spend a lot. Some of our big banks spend more on cybersecurity, $750, $800 million US than some of our allies do. But realistically, the large section of our 85% of the critical infrastructure that's owned and operated by the private sector is not protected to the level it needs to be. And so we both have to increase that investment and improve the government's relations with them, and build that public-private collaboration and share information better and do things better. I think the third big aspect we had, and this one definitely applies to our alliance as well, is we did say you need to defend forward. The United States dramatically changed its authorities and processes for using offensive cyber operations throughout 2018. We passed some law changes that made surveillance and cyber surveillance and reconnaissance and military activity. We had an AUMF. We named 4 countries that we were concerned with: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And then we named some things that if they did this, we can take immediate responses. That was followed up by a presidential memorandum that backed it up, what's called an NSPM 13 decision. And then a series of processes happened, including, it's reported, the defense of our 2020 election cycle. Why that's important is that needs to be married up with other tools, both our own and our allies' tools, economic tools such as sanctions, law enforcement tools such as indictments, diplomatic tools, and even other military tools. to begin to counter the Chinese in the gray zone. And I have to say, it is hard for democracies to compete with authoritarian governments in the gray zone. We're going to have to exercise, think about it, and get better at it. The only thing that's harder than one democracy working in a gray zone against the Chinese is two democracies working in the gray zone against the Chinese. So we're really going to have to do this together. We failed from 2013 to 2015. We basically observed the Chinese conduct a gray zone campaign in the South China Sea, building islands out of non-maritime features. Both our countries did, along with Japan and others, but we can't do that again in cyber. And so we have to figure out how to work better to share attribution data, that is proof someone did it, and share it in minutes, not months. And then have an agreed response structure. Okay, if we see A happen, we'll do B at this time within 2 to 4 hours. We'll do C within 8 to 12 hours, and have that agreed to together. That takes a lot of planning, a lot of work, and most of all, a lot of trust. So the meetings between our senior leaders to kind of set that trust from the top down. It'll meet with trust that's already been worked from the bottom up inside our cryptological and intelligence agencies in order to achieve the kind of processes and operations that are going to be necessary to counter the Chinese going forward. And I have no illusions about their willingness to put that pressure on us. I do have concerns about our willingness and commitment to work together as an alliance structure to press back against the Chinese, but I hope I'm wrong.
Wow, what a rich discussion we've had in just an hour. And I know so much more could be said, but I think everything that's been said in this hour is really important for policymakers in Australia, the United States, and beyond. I really want to thank all four of you, Mark Montgomery, Nina Kollars, Lesley Seebeck, and Peter Jennings, for joining us here at the Hudson Institute. For those watching, I hope you'll also look out for 2 other programs in this series, one on supply chains, another one on political interference. But on behalf of Hudson Institute, thank you very much for joining us, and good day.